Grey, damp scenes. Interesting locations like the one we've got behind us. But if you're like me, after having weeks and weeks of basically the same weather conditions, which are effectively just the, well, you know, rain and cloud, you're probably finding that your image is starting to look all very much the same. And I wanted to do something about that. I wanted to do something that would lift my portfolio a little bit, add some interest and something else into it. Now, I've seen lots of photographers go out and do challenges where they pick up one lens, one focal length and try it, and I've always dismissed it as being not a particularly good idea. But then I came to realise and thought, well, what actually if I pick up a lens which I don't normally use in my photography all the time and go out and shoot just using that lens? So that's what I'm doing today. I've come out with the 70 to 300mm telephoto attached to my camera, and we're only going to be shooting images between 70 and 300mm. And to make it a little bit more challenging, I've actually come to a woodland, local woodland that I know reasonably well, or this part of it anyway. And that gives me some kind of idea of finding some new perspectives and some new images in location that I've previously photographed. So I'm going to go and look for something more suitable to use the long lens on than the chimney behind me and see what we can find. It didn't take me long to find my first subject. I'm actually quite surprised because I thought it would be really hard. But this one image behind me kind of stood out really, and I could just see these birch leaves, well, I think they're birch leaves, sort of hanging on to the branches. Although it's winter, they stay for a long time in that beautiful deep red brown. And of course they've got the muddy sort of green winter background of the trees behind them and also in front of them, and they just stood out. And I think that's where this approach to photography is actually going to work and help with this image better than taking a wide angle view. Because what's important to this picture is getting across my connection with that subject, which was the colour and these leaves standing out, and that's what's caught my eyes, what I want to show people. So the 70 to 300 lens is going to be the way to go. So I don't quite know what focal length I'm going to end up with yet, but the sorts of things which I need to consider when taking this picture, more than the subject itself, is what's around the edges of it. If there's any distractions, what's going to interfere with the feeling of the image, what I'm going to have to do about depth of field. Do I have a sharp background, a blurred background? And if I go for a shallow depth of field, what about the foreground as well? Are we looking at letting that go blurred? Obviously what's going to be important is that the leaves themselves are critically sharp and that they stand out. And I can do a little bit about that in the processing as well. Let's set the camera up and see about taking this image. (1000, 2000), there we go. So I'm taking a few different versions of this image. I think you can see that I've put the camera in the portrait format, and the reason I've done that is because on the final image I think it's going to be a 4:5, and if I crop it as a 4:5, if I do it this way around, I throw away less pixels than I would if I had it in the landscape format. I've also looked at it as a square as well by using the the format sort of settings on the back of the camera in the live view. I can't quite decide what it's going to be yet, and it's all going to be about how it looks on the big screen. I don't think you can really tell out in the field exactly what you're going to get. And even when I was shooting with film, I probably would have, looked at composing the image both ways and then in the darkroom printing it appropriately. So the idea that I've got with this, as I think I was saying before, is this tree's got to stand out on its own. It needs to sort of command the space that it's living in. And the problem is that it's a very tangly background, and there's a lot of detail in there which I want to get rid of. So I've actually decided to shoot at f4.5, which is the widest aperture that I've got for this lens. I'm shooting at 135mm because that gives me the right sort of distance. So it's not super long, but it's okay. And hopefully at that length with the f4.5 aperture, the background will be soft enough so that it doesn't necessarily interfere with what I'm trying to show you. When I process this image, I'm probably going to look at saturating those reds and those browns a little bit, just to make them stand out. And I can also dull back or hold back the greens, maybe darken the edges, just to center your eye on what it is that I want to show you. So like I said, 135mm, f4.5. I'll put the shutter speed up on the screen when I take it. And at this moment in time, it's a mystery to me whether it's going to be a 4.5 or whether it's going to be a square. And I'll put the image up now so you can have a look at it and see how we get on. And then we're going to find our next composition. Although I talk about when you go out trying to come out without any sort of preconceived ideas, inevitably you quite often do. And even today when I was going out to take these photographs, I had an idea that although I was going to try something different, there was a location that I had in mind that I thought would work reasonably well. It's kind of a mini landscape all on its own, with a small little waterfall at the background, a big sort of carve out in the rocks, really nice and smooth by the water action and the surface of the water itself. But actually, to take this picture, 70mm is going to be too long, and I need to get down low, wide, possibly a bit of focus stacking as well, and get close to the image. So what I wanted to do with this image isn't going to work, but I will be back on another day to take it. What I have found though at the same location is another really quite delightful scene that I like. Now I have some concerns about it. I'm afraid that because of the amount of white water and the shadow areas and the contrast that it's not going to work well as an image, but even still, I like the shape, I like the arrangements of the objects in there. I just hope that the white, rapid moving water contacting the edges of the frame doesn't cause too much tension and distraction in the photograph. So what I've found is a place where I could sort of view a small little waterfall coming down behind into a pool, and then much stronger ones below it. And it creates a nice diagonal flow of water through the scene, where it comes from the top right, down the waterfall, across the frame, and then down, exiting through the bottom left. I've included a few foreground elements in this picture just to add some boundaries to the frame and create that visual journey. So hopefully that's going to be enough to keep your eye inside the picture. And what's going to be critical is ensuring that we retain the texture in that water and we've got some information. But it is about flow, so I do want to make sure that I maintain the flow of water. So there's going to be several things which are important. The shutter speed's going to be important. Controlling the exposure and the contrast is going to be important, and that will partly come down to the editing as well. So what I've got to make sure is that I leave with a file or a number of files which have all that information in them. Well, I've set the camera up, to be honest, pretty much as I described that I would. I've managed to find a fairly high viewpoint to look down on the scene. It's far enough back so I can see the tops of the levels of these water and the pools as well. If I'd been too low down, you wouldn't have seen all the water, and you wouldn't have had this sense of flow or movement through it. To give you some sort of idea of what I'm shooting at, I'm taking images about 1/4 of a second, about f11. Now, one of the problems with this image is going to be the depth of field, because I think I need all the elements in the frame to be sharp and just the water moving. If I've got blurred items in the background or in the foreground, it's going to detract from this movement of water that I want to portray in the picture. Now, the lens, I'm actually shooting at about 150mm, and the problem with that, obviously, and shooting at longer focal lengths, is we don't have that depth of field that we would necessarily like. I don't want to push the lens up much above f11 because it's going to change the shutter speed, and if the shutter speed changes, I'm going to have to start increasing the ISO, and that would degrade the quality of the image. So I'm going to stay at the settings that I've got. I've taken some bracketed photographs already, but I'm also going to take some focus stacked images. So the focus stacked images, I'm going to focus on the rocks in the foreground, halfway through the scene, the waterfall area itself, and then on the far background. And we'll join these together in Photoshop. If that works out particularly well, then I may include it in the end of month video, just so you can see my editing process for that. It's also going to be important to control the contrast, because I think if we end up with really dark shadow areas against this white water, I think the contrast is going to be too much, and it's going to detract from the image once again. I'm going to try it as both a colour and a black and white version, and I'll show you the finished item at the end. The other thing I want to raise, just that I've put the polarizer on the lens as well. And the reason I've done that is not to brighten or deepen the saturation of any of the colours, it's to reduce some of the reflections on the surface of the water. And that seems to be working well. It helps me control the highlights. Right, I'm going to take the rest of these pictures. We'll crack on. I think I've got one more picture I'm going to take, possibly. So we'll see how it goes. I may vlog it, I may just put it up at the end for you. It'll depend how long the video's going and how things are working out. So see what you think of this image. I'm a bit of a sucker for a dead tree stump. You can see it just over my shoulder. In fact, it's two dead tree stumps coming up out of the ground with a bit of a fern in the foreground there as well, which hasn't quite gone over yet, but it's looking really quite poorly, as you would expect it to in the middle of winter. This photograph is really can only be done with a long lens. Although I'd like to go in really nice and close and get tight in on this detail, the background is just too messy. It's just too much going on in the background that would detract from the subject itself. So I think it's important to get that separation. So we're going to use the long lens to actually do that. And by going in really close at the 300mm, towards the 300mm end of the lens, and getting a little bit further down the track that's behind you and zooming in on this scene, we'll compress the perspective. But more importantly, what we're also going to do is get plenty of softness in the background so that the tree really stands out against it, and hopefully that'll come over quite well. I may even do this picture as a monochrome image. I'm not quite sure yet. I quite like the colours and the tones, but I think it might work well as a black and white or a monochrome. We'll just see how I feel about it when I process it. So let's get the camera set up, and I'll show you what I mean. So that's the camera all set up. So once again, I've gone for this portrait format. It just suits the subject really well. So where you've got a vertical subject like a tree or a mountain or anything like that, quite often it sort of suits that frame. Depends on what sort of image you're trying to take, but in this case it works exactly how I want it, and I'll go through the composition in a minute and explain exactly why. I've set up on the opposite side of the path and a bit down the path from where I was before, and the reason for that, like I said, is so that I can get a decent amount of focal length into play to try and separate that background. I would like to have got back a bit further really, but there's a tree behind me, and if I start coming back anymore then the tree will be in the way, and if I go further down the path and it changes the angle on the subject, and changing that angle causes another issue because then your composition starts to change as well. So we've settled on where we are, and that gives me about 200 mils, so hopefully that's going to be long enough. So let's set up the composition. So I'll put the raw file up on the screen for you so you can actually see what it is that I'm talking about. But basically what I've done is I've composed this as a 4:5 in camera, and on this final edit you'll see the crop. But basically I've got it so that the tree, the dead tree itself, starts off in the bottom right of the frame, then moves up right to the left and exits, or the main branch exits through the top third. Now I've done that so that it doesn't exit in a corner, so it doesn't create so much tension, because obviously corners of the frame are areas which are quite significant in the composition. So by just taking it through the top a bit, I think it does a little bit less than that. Now I've included the fern in the foreground because hopefully that will come out nice and sharp as well. Oh, it's moving a little bit in the breeze, so it might be a little bit soft, but we'll just see how it works out. So I've set the aperture at f5. Ideally it would have been 4.5, but to do that it would have been a trade-off between, you know, zooming out further. I haven't got a constant aperture lens, and it's not really necessary. The change in focal length probably makes it much better. So that's given me a shutter speed of 15th of a second, which is absolutely fine because we're tripod mounted. I'm not going to bother with a cable release on this. I'll just use the 2-second timer. That's more than adequate than what we need to do. So I'll do my usual sort of bracket when I take the photographs, but we'll get these images in the bag. So I'm going to zoom in on that tree, focus on the tree. Histogram's looking great, 15th of a second, f5, take the picture. Looking at it, it's going to be absolutely fine, but either way I always bracket. I don't know why, it's just a habit from using film, I suppose. So there's a full stop over, correctly exposed, and a full stop under. Lovely, got that spot on. Okay, so I'll put that picture up on the screen for you now. I'm going to make that my last photograph of today. I just want to finish by saying that I've thoroughly enjoyed today's photography. Initially I thought going out with one lens, restricting myself to what I could take, would have been a bit restrictive for me and a bit boring, and maybe I got a bit fed up with it. But to be honest, it's been really, really good. It was completely the opposite. It made me think about my photography, made me look for images that I could take using just this lens. So if you're in doubt as to whether these sort of self-imposed challenges actually work, then my advice would be go out, give it a go, try it, it does work. Maybe in the comments, if you do that, put something down there about your own experiences of shooting with just one lens and seeing how you got on as well. But until then, I'm going to put this finished image up on the screen for you. Get out there, enjoy your photography, and I'll see you in the next video.